Good morning. Significant developments are unfolding on the global economic stage. Chinese tariffs imposed on goods originating from the United States are scheduled to increase, moving from 34% up to 84%, effective tomorrow. This escalation marks a critical point in the ongoing economic tension between the two largest economies. Beijing's Ministry of Commerce has strongly reacted, accusing the Trump administration of engaging in blackmail. Furthermore, they characterize the newly imposed tariffs as a classic example of unilateral bullying tactics. This situation underscores that the contest for global influence between the United States and China has moved far beyond mere diplomatic discussions or ideological disagreements. It is now a tangible reality, playing out across international financial markets, disrupting established shipping routes, and forcing adjustments in economic policies worldwide. The consequences of these actions are reverberating broadly. They are being acutely felt from the financial centers of Wall Street all the way to the agricultural communities in rural towns. The impact extends across various sectors, affecting everyone from cutting-edge technology companies to the farmers who cultivate the land. We are witnessing a complex interplay of economic forces with far-reaching effects. Remember, we'll be exploring the full implications and drawing conclusions later in this video, so stay tuned. Numerous significant events have transpired globally, and we aim to delve into them. Your support is crucial for our channel's growth, so please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The struggle for worldwide dominance involving the United States and the People's Republic of China is no longer confined to diplomatic channels or clashes of ideology. This confrontation is actively materializing in real time, impacting financial markets, altering maritime trade paths, and reshaping economic strategies globally. The ripple effects are palpable, extending from the bustling financial district of Wall Street to remote rural communities, and influencing sectors ranging from high-tech corporations to agricultural producers. At the core of this high-stakes struggle stand two immensely influential figures, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Both leaders are leveraging every instrument available to them in an effort to remold the existing global structure to better suit their respective national interests. Trump articulated his perspective clearly, stating, "I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up. They are dying to make a deal." This statement reflects a confidence in the effectiveness of his administration's tariff strategy as a tool for negotiation. Please make sure to watch this video through to the end, as we will be providing concluding thoughts and analysis on these complex developments. Speaking at a Republican fundraising dinner just last night, President Trump asserted that numerous nations are urgently seeking agreements with the United States, particularly as fresh tariffs become active today. He emphasized their reluctance towards imposing duties on their own goods, stating, "They don't want tariffs on themselves. And it's very simple. We're making deals, and people are paying tariffs." This statement highlights the administration's belief that tariffs serve as effective leverage in trade negotiations. However, this increasingly strained international atmosphere is causing significant turbulence in financial markets, which are now experiencing wild fluctuations. Uncertainty and market volatility have unfortunately become the prevailing conditions, the new standard by which global economic interactions are measured. Underscoring this instability, a senior executive from BlackRock, recognized as the planet's largest asset management firm overseeing assets exceeding $11 trillion, characterized the present situation as profoundly unstable. This executive specifically pointed out that the most significant area of unpredictability revolves around the potential extent and duration of these tariffs, essentially how high they might go and for how long they will remain implemented. While market indicators might occasionally display brief moments of optimism, perhaps showing upward trends on specific days, the overarching sentiment within the financial community continues to be marked by fragility. This delicate balance was further disturbed today when China's Ministry of Finance made a significant announcement. It intends to increase tariffs on all American goods, elevating them from the existing 34% to a substantial 84%. This move represents a clear and considerable setback for any American enterprise aiming to penetrate one of the globe's most significant consumer markets. This decision, enacted as a direct retaliation against President Trump's earlier tariff hikes on Chinese imports, which themselves currently stand at a minimum level of 104%, has propagated another powerful shockwave throughout the world's financial systems. Consequently, futures for U.S. stock indices experienced a sharp decline. Similarly, Germany's DAX index also saw a steep drop, serving as a stark illustration of the deep interconnectedness of the global economy and highlighting the acute sensitivity of markets to these major policy announcements and headline-grabbing shifts. This isn't merely an abstract figure recorded in a government accounting book. It signifies a monumental shift possessing severe, tangible consequences in the real world. Every single American corporation conducting business within China, spanning the spectrum from consumer product manufacturers to heavy industrial operations, is currently confronting a considerably more challenging economic landscape. The newly imposed tariffs are set to drive up operational costs, restrict potential sales volumes, and, in all likelihood, result in diminished profits for these companies. Adding another layer to this complex situation, Beijing has officially confirmed its intention to bring the Trump administration before the World Trade Organization, WTO, to contest these measures. Furthermore, Chinese governmental officials have subtly indicated that additional retaliatory actions might be forthcoming, suggesting a potential further escalation of trade tensions between the two economic giants. It's a situation demanding close observation as its effects continue to unfold across the global economic stage. We often overlook the political dynamics influencing leaders such as Chinese President Xi Jinping. While he may not face the same electoral pressures common in democratic systems and isn't preoccupied with an upcoming re-election campaign in the traditional sense, President Xi is undoubtedly concerned with maintaining his legitimacy and cementing his historical legacy. From this perspective, Donald Trump's actions have arguably cornered him. As previous reports indicated, China appears to be preparing for a protracted struggle. Compounding the situation, China has recently added 6 United States entities to its list of unreliable entities, alongside another 12 entities placed on its export control list. These actions serve to further intensify the already strained trade relationship. Although these designations might appear as purely bureaucratic procedures, they carry substantial real-world implications. Inclusion on these lists signifies that the targeted companies could face significant restrictions, potentially even being prohibited entirely from engaging in trade activities with Chinese firms. These measures typically focus on businesses involved in trade related to areas deemed sensitive by Beijing, such as those concerning Taiwan or Hong Kong, or involving technologies considered politically or strategically significant. In certain instances, individuals associated with these targeted companies might also become subject to sanctions imposed by the Chinese government. It's widely understood that China cannot directly match the United States tariffs on a dollar-for-dollar basis. This is primarily because the volume of Chinese goods exported to the U.S. significantly exceeds the volume of American goods imported into China. However, China possesses alternative forms of leverage that it can utilize. Agriculture represents one such significant lever. This sector experienced considerable hardship during previous rounds of tariff exchanges. Should the Chinese government opt to target American agricultural products once more, a possibility alluded to by state-controlled media outlets, it would directly impact President Trump's political support base located in rural America. Such a move would also reinforce the perception that this ongoing trade dispute extends beyond purely economic considerations, becoming increasingly personal in nature. Simultaneously, China is actively working to transform this challenging situation into a strategic opportunity. During a meeting held today, President Xi Jinping declared China's intention to broaden its trade relationships with adjacent nations, placing particular emphasis on the Southeast Asian region. This initiative encompasses countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, nations that have found themselves caught in the middle of the escalating U.S. tariff implementations. These neighboring countries have experienced increased costs and diminished access to the American market due to the trade conflict, making China's efforts to strengthen ties potentially more appealing. By fortifying relationships within the region, China aims to mitigate the negative impact of reduced trade with the United States. Furthermore, This strategy could potentially lead to a reshaping of global supply chains, making them less dependent on Western markets in the long term. In parallel, Chinese state media has adopted a noticeably more assertive stance, openly mocking what it characterizes as other nations pleading with the U.S. for exemptions from tariffs. From Beijing's vantage point, President Trump's strategy seems focused on isolating countries individually, compelling them into bilateral agreements, rather than adhering to established multilateral trade protocols. Conversely, China asserts its continued commitment to supporting a global trade system based on established rules, a message that might find resonance among developing nations feeling constrained by American protectionist policies. All these developments are occurring within an economic climate already saturated with uncertainty. International corporations, whose operations depend heavily on intricate global supply chains, are feeling the pressure intensely. Consider the example of Boeing's 737 aircraft. Each plane is constructed from approximately 2,000 individual parts, sourced from a network of 700 suppliers distributed across the planet. The wings, for instance, originate from Japan, while the fuselage is manufactured in Italy. Certain doors are produced in Canada, and the engines are provided by the renowned British company Rolls-Royce. The notion of relocating all this production back to domestic shores, as suggested by President Trump, is a monumental undertaking that would require years to accomplish and incur costs reaching into the billions of dollars. In the immediate term, escalating tariffs simply translate into higher costs associated with conducting business. Airlines such as Ryanair, which currently have orders for dozens of Boeing aircraft, could potentially face supplementary import duties amounting to over £400 million. These increased expenses are unlikely to be absorbed solely by the airlines. Instead, they will almost certainly be transferred to passengers in the form of higher air travel prices. The impact isn't limited to the aviation sector alone. The repercussions ripple outwards, affecting a vast array of goods, from smartphones and televisions to automobiles and apparel. These are inherently global industries, meticulously built over decades upon interconnected trade relationships. Attempting to dismantle these complex networks rapidly is, frankly, an impossibility. As apprehension spreads, corporations are adopting a cautious stance, effectively hitting the pause button. Investment initiatives are being put on hold, and the launch of new projects is facing delays. Consequently, the typical pace of job creation, factory expansion, and hiring has noticeably slowed down. Financial analysts, including those at institutions like BlackRock, identify this pervasive hesitancy as the most significant underlying threat. Economies thrive on forward momentum. When that momentum falters, stagnation can take hold, potentially leading to enduring consequences that extend far beyond the immediate concerns reflected in news headlines. Beneath the surface of all these events lies a more profound question concerning the very structure of the global economy. Is the existing system undergoing a process of dismantlement, or is it merely being reshaped into a new, yet undefined configuration? Since 1944, the international economic landscape has largely functioned under the principles of the Bretton Woods system, characterized by the prominence of the US dollar and relatively open global trade channels. However, under the leadership of President Trump, there has been a distinct shift away from this established framework. President Trump has, in fact, openly contemplated weakening the US dollar as a means to stimulate exports. This represents a significant departure from decades of established economic policy, favoring what his administration perceives as a more advantageous arrangement for the United States. Presently, financial markets are closely observing these developments and reacting accordingly. Yet beyond the fluctuating market charts and official press statements, a fundamental power struggle is underway. This contest carries enormous implications, not solely for the United States and China, but for the entire international community. Each newly implemented tariff, every significant drop in stock market values, and each retaliatory action taken represents a further step into uncharted economic and geopolitical territory. With both major powers seemingly entrenching their positions, the pertinent question is no longer just about the immediate next steps. It extends to the potential duration of this conflict and, crucially, the nature of the global economic landscape that will emerge once this period of tension eventually subsides. In Washington, D.C., the Trump administration steadfastly maintains that the implemented tariffs represent a vital corrective measure. According to former officials who held positions during President Trump's initial term in office, the United States is essentially reacting to prolonged periods of what they deem unfair trade practices originating from China. These practices, they contend, have negatively impacted American workers, involved the theft of intellectual property, and facilitated the emergence of a formidable economic rival. One such former official, Nazak Nakakhtar, who previously served as Assistant Secretary within the U.S. Department of Commerce, asserts that this assertive stance is significantly overdue. She highlights that, from the viewpoint of numerous individuals within the policy-making and national security spheres, the pre-existing situation regarding trade with China had reached an unsustainable point. Over many years, successive American administrations engaged in negotiations with Beijing, granted access to U.S. markets, supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization, and actively promoted foreign direct investment into the Chinese economy. However, critics argue that despite these efforts, China persisted in subsidizing its domestic industries, participating in market manipulation, and limiting access to its own extensive market. Nakakhtar posits that President Trump's current policies are a direct consequence of these long-standing grievances, and that China should not be taken aback by this response. From her perspective, the United States is no longer prepared to passively accept what it views as its own economic detriment, making a fundamental reset, however disruptive, a necessary step. She further emphasizes that the Trump administration's strategy transcends mere economic policy. It is fundamentally conceived as a measure to safeguard national security interests. By curtailing technology transfers and lessening reliance on Chinese manufacturing capabilities, the U.S. government seeks to ensure that its industries and military infrastructure are not vulnerable to potential risks posed by a nation increasingly viewed as both a competitor and a potential adversary. The administration's tone in this matter is resolutely firm. Nakakhtar also observes that President Xi Jinping is arguably a different leader now compared to his position in 2018, during the initial stages of these trade discussions. In her assessment, President Xi has subsequently solidified his authority, tightened control over strategically important industries, and implemented measures aimed at developing domestic capabilities in high-technology supply chains, reducing reliance on foreign sources. From the perspective of the Chinese government, this ongoing trade conflict represents more than just an economic hurdle. It touches upon fundamental issues of national sovereignty and dignity. This viewpoint finds resonance among Chinese academics and scholars. Dr. Yu Ji, a senior research fellow specializing in China studies at Chatham House, concurs that the dispute has evolved considerably beyond purely economic dimensions. She suggests that the trade war has taken on symbolic significance, representing a much wider geopolitical competition between the two powers. For Beijing, the current situation is no longer simply about securing more favorable trade terms. It's perceived as a resistance against what is seen as an American effort to curb China's global ascent. Dr. Yu further elaborates that China is navigating this complex situation by considering both its internal domestic dynamics and its international position. Domestically, President Xi Jinping must preserve strong public backing, especially considering a populace that has demonstrated growing nationalistic sentiment in recent years. A prevalent belief exists within China that the United States is actively attempting to impede the nation's progress, particularly in the realms of technological advancement and global influence. This perception, irrespective of its factual accuracy, compels the Chinese leadership to publicly maintain a resolute stance, even if behind-the-scenes diplomatic channels remain active. The second dimension, as Dr. Yu outlines, pertains to China's evolving role on the global stage. By positioning itself as a proponent of multilateralism and established international trade regulations, Beijing aims to create a contrast between its approach and what it portrays as Washington's unpredictability and tendency towards unilateral actions. In diplomatic engagements with Southeast Asian nations, China has actively promoted enhanced regional partnerships, presenting alternative trade avenues and fostering cooperation outside the traditional U.S.-centric global framework. This strategic pivot is already manifesting in international trade statistics. China's exports to the United States have experienced a notable decline since the initial implementation of tariffs. In reaction, China has markedly increased its trade activities with countries across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Although this transition is unlikely to occur instantaneously, Beijing demonstrates a clear commitment to diminishing its reliance on the American market. Paradoxically, the trade war itself might be inadvertently accelerating this diversification process, potentially pushing it forward at a faster pace than originally anticipated. Dr. Yu points out that President Xi Jinping's overarching long-term strategy includes attaining self-sufficiency in technology and achieving greater economic independence. While acknowledging the likelihood of short-term economic disruptions, the Chinese leadership appears to view these challenges as an integral part of a necessary transformation towards strengthening domestic consumption and upgrading the nation's industrial base. For instance, government initiatives aimed at bolstering China's semiconductor industry, lessening dependence on foreign software providers, and stimulating local innovation have all received increased emphasis since the onset of the tariff conflict. Viewed through this lens, the trade war could, in effect, be reinforcing some of China's existing internal policy objectives. However, simultaneously, the tangible costs associated with this conflict are undeniable and mounting. Chinese businesses are acutely feeling the strain. Export volumes have decelerated, some manufacturing facilities have ceased operations, and a broader economic slowdown has induced caution among consumers. While the Chinese government possesses substantial financial resources and a large domestic market, enabling it to withstand a significant portion of the economic pressure, the adverse effects are palpable. This is particularly true for smaller manufacturing enterprises and exporters operating with low profit margins, who are disproportionately affected by the ongoing trade tensions. On the American side of the equation, the rationale for persisting with high tariffs remains firmly anchored in the conviction that China's trade practices will not fundamentally alter unless subjected to significant real consequences. President Trump and his trade advisors have consistently asserted that previous diplomatic efforts, including China's accession to the WTO and numerous bilateral discussions, have ultimately failed to yield durable, satisfactory results. Their core argument posits that implementing shock therapy through tariffs is the sole viable method to compel China into undertaking meaningful structural reforms within its economy. These reforms specifically target areas such as state subsidies for domestic industries, the protection of intellectual property rights, and ensuring fair market access for foreign companies. Nevertheless, critics raise concerns regarding the lack of a clearly defined exit strategy or endgame for this tariff-centric approach. Even within policy circles in Washington, there is escalating apprehension about the potential negative repercussions or fallout from these actions. Recent congressional hearings have highlighted a degree of bipartisan discomfort with the administration's current strategy. Lawmakers representing both major political parties have questioned the existence of a comprehensive, well-thought-out plan, speculating whether the current approach is predominantly reactive and perhaps improvised, rather than strategically planned. Some express fears that the White House might have inadvertently initiated a sequence of events, akin to opening Pandora's box, without fully considering the potential long-term ramifications. Others voice anxiety that the conflict could potentially escalate beyond manageable control. Historically, extended trade disputes have, on occasion, served as precursors to broader international confrontations. While few experts anticipate an imminent military conflict between the United States and China, the evident erosion of trust and breakdown in communication undeniably heightens the overall level of risk involved. As Dr. Yu observes, both nations are currently grappling not only with economic strains, but also with the pressures of nationalistic sentiment among their respective domestic populations. This complex interplay makes finding mutually acceptable compromises increasingly challenging from a political standpoint, even if there exists a private desire on both sides to prevent further escalation of the trade dispute. Supporters of President Trump's policies argue that he is merely taking long overdue actions that previous leaders should have initiated years prior. They contend he is championing the interests of American workers, insisting on fair trade practices and directly confronting China's economic rise on terms designed to benefit the United States. However, even among these proponents, there is an acknowledgement that this assertive strategy carries inherent risks. Retaliatory actions can often be unforeseen, and financial markets typically react negatively to periods of instability. When the two largest economies on the planet are engaged in a reciprocal trade conflict, the consequences rarely remain confined to just those two nations. This dispute extends beyond simple tariffs on physical goods. It fundamentally concerns the establishment of rules and norms that will govern international commerce for the foreseeable future. Critical areas such as technology standards, the regulation of digital trade, and access to vital resources like rare earth minerals are all part of this larger negotiation. The United States and China are each striving to shape these systems in ways that align with their respective long-term interests. The stakes involved in this process are exceptionally high. The nation that ultimately succeeds in setting these global rules will gain a substantial advantage, not merely in economic terms, but also in terms of geopolitical influence. Therefore, while the immediate focus for many consumers and investors remains on fluctuating prices and market volatility, the underlying reality involves a much broader, more strategic contest. It is fundamentally a competition centered on global influence, differing value systems, and ultimately, determining which nation will predominantly define the next era of globalization. Both Washington and Beijing are explicitly framing this conflict within these strategic parameters. President Trump's administration believes that exerting maximum pressure currently will generate the necessary leverage for the United States to secure favorable long-term outcomes. Conversely, China's leadership perceives the tariffs as an element within a larger strategy aimed at hindering its national development and preserving American global dominance. In both interpretations, the driving logic is not solely based on economic principles, but is deeply intertwined with considerations of international power politics. As the official rhetoric intensifies and new policies continue to crystallize, it becomes increasingly apparent that this trade war transcends a simple disagreement over trade figures. It represents a profound test of national determination and will. Both the United States and China appear convinced that they have too much at stake to concede ground, believing they stand to gain significantly by maintaining their firm positions. Within such a polarized environment, the prospects for compromise diminish, rendering negotiated solutions not only improbable, but also politically fraught. Behind every policy announcement regarding tariffs, each significant downturn in the stock market, and every official press briefing, lie the real-life experiences of families, employees, and business proprietors endeavoring to navigate an increasingly unpredictable global landscape. Across communities, whether in regions like Virginia, the American heartland, or established manufacturing centers, a palpable sense of anxiety is growing. Many individuals initially supported Donald Trump, hoping his assertive posture on trade issues would rejuvenate American industries, safeguard domestic jobs, and exert pressure on nations like China to adhere to fair trade practices. However, the most immediate and tangible consequences observed thus far include escalating costs for consumers, heightened market volatility, and a pervasive feeling of economic instability. Consider the illustrative case of Gabriel, a nurse and mother managing the care of a 2-year-old child. She recently shared that the rising cost of living has compelled her to take on additional work shifts simply to cover essential expenses. Prices for everyday necessities, particularly items like baby supplies and common household goods, are steadily increasing. A significant portion of these products are imported from manufacturers in Asia and Europe, and they now carry inflated price tags due to the additional costs imposed by the ongoing trade conflict. For households already operating under tight financial constraints, this added economic pressure is keenly felt. Then there is the experience of Jim, employed in the construction sector. He reports observing a dramatic surge in the cost of essential raw materials, a trend that began even before the most recent tariffs were implemented. While expressing continued belief in the president's overall strategy, Jim acknowledges that these price increases are directly impacting his ability to manage his work effectively and are affecting the final costs passed on to his clients. Virtually everything required for construction projects, from basic timber and steel to specialized fixtures and fittings, now commands a higher price. This reality makes undertaking new projects significantly more expensive and introduces challenges in adhering to project timelines and budgets. Although Jim remains optimistic about the potential for prices to eventually stabilize over the long term, in the present moment, he finds himself among countless workers directly affected by the cross-currents of this trade dispute. Beyond these individual accounts, the broader economic data paints a concerning picture. Financial markets have demonstrated significant sensitivity, reacting sharply to each announcement of new tariffs or retaliatory measures implemented by either side. Consequently, investment vehicles such as pensions, retirement savings accounts, and 401k plans have experienced setbacks as overall market confidence has weakened. This climate of uncertainty leaves investors feeling nervous, prompts business leaders to adopt a more cautious approach, and causes consumers, especially those approaching retirement age who rely on stable investments, to become increasingly apprehensive about their financial futures. Even prominent figures within the technology sector are voicing their concerns and becoming involved in the discourse. Elon Musk, previously perceived by some as an ally of the Trump administration due to shared interests in promoting American innovation and industry, has publicly voiced criticism of the administration's current trade policies. In a widely publicized disagreement, Musk described Peter Navarro, President Trump's chief trade advisor, in disparaging terms, suggesting a lack of understanding regarding trade matters. This specific conflict erupted after Navarro accused Musk and other business leaders of merely assembling final products using inexpensive foreign-sourced components, thereby contributing, in Navarro's assessment, to the United States trade deficit. This public dispute serves to highlight a growing divergence of views, not only in the broader context of U.S.-China relations, but also potentially within the internal deliberations of the White House itself. While President Trump's core advisors maintain that the tariffs function as necessary shock therapy intended to fundamentally reset global trade norms in favor of American interests, other influential voices within the business and investment sectors express skepticism. They argue that the U.S. economy, despite its strengths in various areas, remains deeply integrated with and dependent upon global supply chains. From their perspective, the current tariff policies are hindering, rather than helping, the ability of American companies to compete effectively on the international stage. This inherent tension was clearly evident during recent testimony before congressional committees on Capitol Hill. Trade officials faced rigorous questioning from lawmakers representing both Democratic and Republican parties. Some legislators queried whether the administration possessed a truly comprehensive long-term strategy, or if the current actions were largely reactive and perhaps improvised. Concerns were raised about the administration having potentially initiated a complex series of actions without fully anticipating the potential consequences. A specific senator inquired pointedly about the existence of a detailed plan, questioning whether the current approach might be characterized as a haphazard, incompetent effort, lacking clear objectives. Other lawmakers raised questions about accountability, asking who would bear responsibility if the implemented policies ultimately proved detrimental. When questioned about the possibility of granting exemptions for specific industries, such as textiles, where domestic manufacturing capacity is limited, the response from the administration was reportedly unequivocal. No exemptions would be granted, and there would be no postponement of the tariff implementations. The tariffs were set to proceed as announced. This rigid stance has generated frustration among many legislators, especially those representing districts whose local economies rely heavily on international trade. They express apprehension about the potential negative impact on small businesses, importers, and the overall economic health of their constituencies. American consumers are already beginning to experience the tangible effects of these policies. Increased costs are being observed across a wide range of goods, from automobiles and electronic devices to clothing and food products. Some of this price inflation is a direct consequence of the tariffs themselves. Other price increases stem from the broader economic uncertainty generated by the trade conflict, which has led to higher costs associated with shipping and logistics. Regardless of the specific cause, the net effect is that households throughout the United States are witnessing a reduction in their effective purchasing power. The impact is not limited to consumers alone. Manufacturing companies that depend on components imported from overseas are now forced to reevaluate and potentially restructure their entire supply chain operations. In numerous instances, readily available domestic alternatives for these components simply do not exist, particularly at comparable levels of quality or cost. The process of shifting production facilities and sourcing new suppliers is complex and time-consuming, often requiring years to fully implement. During this transitional period, businesses inevitably face increased operational costs and reduced profit margins. This situation poses particular challenges for industries that typically operate with narrow profit margins, making them especially vulnerable to cost fluctuations. Consider the United States automotive industry as a prime example. This sector relies on the importation of thousands of distinct components sourced from various locations around the globe, with a significant portion originating from China. These specialized parts are often not easily substitutable. The direct consequence of tariffs on these components includes higher manufacturing costs, diminished competitiveness in the global market, and ultimately, increased prices for consumers purchasing new vehicles. It's noteworthy that even automotive companies that assemble their vehicles within the United States remain heavily reliant on these intricate global supply networks for essential parts. Despite these evident challenges and economic pressures, President Trump's advisors insist that the current difficulties are both necessary and temporary. They maintain the belief that once the initial disruptions subside and the global trade landscape adjusts, the United States will ultimately emerge in a more advantageous economic position. They argue that the tariffs are effectively compelling other countries to engage in negotiations. Official statements even claim that over 70 nations have initiated contact with the White House to discuss trade matters in response to the new tariff regime. However, the underlying reality remains considerably more intricate. International trade negotiations are inherently lengthy and complex processes. While these discussions unfold, the global economy continues to operate in a state of heightened uncertainty and tension. This situation is causing friction even among established allies of the United States. European leaders, for instance, have expressed disagreement with being subjected to the same trade measures as economic competitors like China. Their position is that they should be collaborating with the U.S. to reform the global trade system, rather than being targeted by the same aggressive tariff policies. In countries such as Germany, the negative economic consequences are already becoming apparent. Manufacturing output is slowing. Exporters are expressing nervousness about future prospects, and overall confidence in the stability of global trade is diminishing rapidly. Furthermore, there is growing concern regarding the potential strain on international alliances. Some foreign governments interpret the tariffs not just as isolated trade measures, but as part of a larger strategic effort by the Trump administration to fundamentally alter the global order. This includes potentially weakening long-standing partnerships and prioritizing bilateral agreements over established multilateral frameworks. While such an approach might resonate positively with certain domestic political constituencies, it carries the significant risk of isolating the United States internationally at a time when global cooperation on critical issues like climate change, technological advancement, and public health is arguably more vital than ever. Meanwhile, within the United States itself, from everyday conversations in local diners to high-level discussions in corporate boardrooms and within households, a central question is increasingly being posed. What is the ultimate objective? What is the intended outcome of these policies? And perhaps most critically, who stands to genuinely benefit from this ongoing trade conflict? While some individuals maintain faith in the long-term strategic vision, others express growing concern that the economic damage currently being inflicted could require many years to fully repair. The adage that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs may contain an element of truth, but a significant number of Americans are beginning to question whether the underlying strategy, or recipe, was ever comprehensively developed. As each new wave of tariffs is implemented and subsequently met with countermeasures from Beijing, the stakes involved in this high-risk geopolitical contest continue to escalate. For the time being, President Trump maintains a posture of defiance. His trade representatives assert that the administration remains steadfast in its objectives. They expressed confidence that the tariffs are achieving their intended effect and anticipate that additional countries will eventually align with the U.S. position. However, given the persistent market instability, the evident pressure on various industries, and the growing unease among the voting public, the long-term sustainability of this unwavering stance remains uncertain. The stated goal of the trade war was to create a more equitable global economic playing field. Yet at present, many Americans perceive that they are the ones bearing the primary financial burden. If consumer prices continue their upward trajectory, job security remains precarious, and investment levels continue to contract, the current levels of frustration are poised to intensify further. As the global economy collectively holds its breath in anticipation of future developments, the ensuing actions taken by both Washington and Beijing will be scrutinized with intense interest, not merely within the respective capitals, but within every household, business enterprise, and financial market already experiencing the tangible consequences of this unprecedented international standoff.